Welcome to Overeducated and Underemployed. I'm Feddun, and today we are talking about the scientific method and how the scientific method has actually contributed to the mistrust and lack of understanding of science. E.O. Wilson, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning biologist and someone that I actually got to meet a couple of times before he passed away a few years ago, E.O. Wilson, Ed Wilson, once said, "We're drowning in information while we're starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely." I'm not going to pretend to be one of those people, but I do think that I've stumbled upon a pretty explanation for why there are so many people that are so quick to be dismissive of scientific inquiry. We're going to talk about the scientific method. And we're not going to just talk about the actual scientific method and whether or not there even is one. And we're going to talk about the traditional scientific method that is taught to people in science education across the world that most of us are already thinking about right now: observation, hypothesis, experiment, etc., etc. I know I jumped around there, and that doesn't really matter because that's a heuristic device that was largely constructed in the 19th and early 20th century as a way to help professionalize science. Is it of a description of the way science works sometimes? Sure. I don't think that there's anything wrong with using the way that the scientific method is described in science education as a heuristic device to understand how science works. That's fine. What it is not is the way that science always must be done all the time, or even the way that science is actually done most of the time. Science is definitely bound by our culture, but what makes it different than, say, religion or superstition or mythology or even just a regular belief is that the findings of science can be repeated. The public has access to those findings and the evidence that supports them, and the fact that we are willing to update our understanding of the world in the scientific community with new information. When new information presents itself, we can integrate that information into our worldview. The worldview isn't fixed, right? That being said, science at any given time is only the best understanding that we have of the physical world at that time. So the scientific method, if taught as an example, can help people understand some of the ways that we validate the information within the scientific community and the processes that they follow. They're not universal, though. And teaching them is part of what has led to some of the biggest misunderstandings of the way that science operates that we've seen. When you think about the way science is actually conducted versus the way that we talk about the scientific method in science education, the way science is actually conducted is messy and full of cultural presuppositions and bound by the desires of the people that make decisions about what gets researched and what gets ignored and what projects get funding and what don't. There's no denying any of that. And to talk about the scientific method without talking about any of that makes it seem like science really isn't trustworthy once you start to learn about all these cultural influences that can happen with science. But the difference is repeatability, time, and our willingness to adjust our worldview based on new information. Now, some philosophers of science have said that you don't ever really convince people that disagree with you once you have new information. Once they're set in their ways, you argue with them until they die, and a new generation of scientists is brought up in the newer worldview. But that's going down a rabbit hole that I'm not really prepared to tackle today. What I am prepared to tackle is the idea that the scientific method, and I'm using air quotes here, the scientific method is even a thing. In fact, the way that the scientific method is taught in schools varies, and the way that it's framed to students has a severe impact on the way that they understand how science works. That's been well documented. You can check out a paper from 2003 called Attitudes Towards Science. It's a review of the literature and its implications. It's from the International Journal of Science Education. Essentially, just exposing exactly what I'm talking about. Traditional education has taught that there's this set of strict methodology and step-by-step process that scientists operate by. And scientists have been pushing back for a long time against this, arguing that there isn't a unified scientific method that doesn't reflect how science actually works. Like I said, it can be used as a heuristic tool to help people understand some of the scientific processes and things like that. But if science is bound by our culture and bound by the attitudes and presuppositions of the people that do it, and the way that we teach science to the general population affects how they view science as a field, then we're automatically poisoning the well before they even decide whether or not to become scientists sometimes. If we're not teaching a clear understanding of how science does work, it makes people think people aren't doing science when they see scientists doing things other than what they were taught as the scientific method. And it also gives people a very rigid view of what science should and can be, which results in a very narrow focus in the science being done by the people with those worldviews. And I'm talking about scientists who just have a very limited view of what they think science's underlying methods are, right? That being said, we're constantly shifting the way that experiments are done, hypotheses are tested, how even observations are formed. Even the tools that we develop can change our understanding of what an observation is or what can be observed. So if science doesn't really operate by the scientific method and it's bound by our culture, how can we trust it? What does hold the scientific community together if it's not a set of standard methodologies? When I started this episode, I really thought I was talking just about the scientific method. As I started planning it, I started realizing that I'm really just talking about the reasons people do not trust science. That brings me to Lee Smolin. So if scientists are bound by anything at all, it's not a methodology. The first double-blind study wasn't even conducted until 1937. Placebo study was not even conducted until 1937. What we can observe now would have been unfathomable to scientists 200 years ago. You couldn't even really explain some of the discoveries that we've made now to somebody from 200 years ago because the foundations of what make up our belief have changed so much. It hasn't even been 200 years since The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was released. Now that's a really good case study of how science works, because you had a man who did a lot of the things that you might be able to recognize in the scientific method, but he made multiple observations based on entirely other fields of science, or sometimes not even science at all. Around the time that Darwin was on the Beagle, they were building railroads across the United States and tunnels. And when you blow up mountains, you start to find fossils. You also start to understand geologic time in a new way when you cut into a mountain. So all of these things were bound by our culture. right? The fact that we were building railroads at all, had the advance in technology to colonize further, to need railways to transport goods, all of these things that were bound by our culture and our human achievement that really didn't have much to do with science are what led to geologists understanding just how old the earth was. And when you increase that geologic timescale and you start to recognize changes over time in certain populations of species, and then you bring in something like Malthus, right, who's a sociologist who talked about how there would never be enough resources to feed the number of people in a society. We would always have some level of starvation and poverty. And he puts all these things together and then combines them with his observations in the natural world to develop his theory of natural selection. And then he sits on it for 20 years and he confirms it and essentially does what the scientific community is set up to do after a discovery is made. But he understood the implications of his discovery and he wanted to be very sure. And I'll tell the story a little bit later down the line in the podcast, another episode about Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin and Thomas Henry Huxley and how this young dude with barely any evidence almost published Darwin's theory right out from under him. But if anything, that just suggests that the theory was somewhat inevitable based on the information that we had already discovered as a society, as a humankind. Now, what Darwin discovered has been refined and changed, and there have been all sorts of new discoveries made about what he was talking about. But you couldn't even really talk biology to someone prior to 1859 with our lexicon and way of thinking. If you go to Animal Kingdom at Disney World and you visit their little conservation island, Rafiki's conservation island, right? You enter their conservation center and you see a Dobzhansky quote, Theodosis Dobzhansky, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. He said this in 1973. 124 years after the theory of evolution, the theory of natural selection, rather, was published. In just 124 years, the view of scientists was that nothing biology even made sense anymore if you didn't look at it through the lens of Charles Darwin's work. And that brings me to Lee Smolin. So if science isn't operating on like a set of methodologies, then what is it? Because there's obviously something holding it all together. Smolin boiled it down to two ethical principles that we all follow. So in 2013, Lee wrote an essay, article for Big Think, which is an online publication. The publication isn't really what matters because the author is credible. Lee Smolin is a very well-regarded philosopher of science. Big Think is a pop science type website. This was not in some kind of academic journal, which is really a shame because I think he's onto something here. Lee Smolin says there is no scientific method. That's the name of the article. He says that science is actually guided by two ethical principles. He says, we agree to tell the truth and we agree to be governed by rational argument from public evidence. Okay? And secondly, when the evidence is not sufficient to decide from rational argument whether one point of view is right or another point of view is right, we agree to encourage competition and diversification. He goes on to clarify that he does not want some kind of a free-for-all, anything goes scenario. He's still talking about science being done by accredited scientists who had scientific training in a university. And he's talking about the ethics within the community of people who have that accreditation and are working within that community. I think thinking about science as being guided by these ethical principles instead of being guided by some methodology is really useful in a lot of ways. For one, our ethical principles are something that we tend to carry around with us a lot more within our person than some methodology that just exists out there in the world. It's really important that when we start to get into scientific debate with people, if we start asking them about their methodology, there's all kinds of ways that they can answer that because there's all kinds of ways that you can do science. And I'm not saying that their methodologies would be valid, but it's a lot easier to disguise it than if you operate from, are they operating from these two ethical principles that all scientists seem to agree on? And no, I'm not talking about science shaping public policy. I'm talking about scientific discovery. When it comes to science shaping public policy, obviously it should. I don't necessarily know what the answer is when you have policymakers who are not participating in those ethical principles. But to start to debate them when they aren't even operating within the same framework that you are is really a fool's errand. And that's part of what has denigrated the integrity of the scientific community. The perception of it, at least. Because when you start to have scientific debates with people that aren't even participating in the same framework of ethical principles that guide what make science possible, then you're going to be led down all these rabbit holes that have nothing to do with science. Now, why don't people trust science inherently already? Like, what makes them lean toward this kind of disposition to be in a position where they're just like, I'm easily swayed that science is false? I think one, when they're taught a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is, when they're taught the methodologies instead of the ethical principles, you're just talking about the things scientists do sometimes instead of what makes a scientist. And so I think a lot of people think that they are engaging in scientific debate when they're not even playing by the same rules. And they're not even doing it maliciously, right? They're just having a different conversation. And a lot of the time, this is the result of bad theology when it comes to people that mistrust science for religious reasons. Most people who don't believe in something like evolution because of a religious belief hold that belief because they're usually operating from a God of the gaps type of theology. And the God of the gaps is like wherever we don't know something, that's where God is. And it's fundamentally like it's bad science and it's bad theology because the more our understanding of the way that the physical world operates, the smaller your God gets, right? So automatically, people with religious beliefs that have a God of the gaps theology, anytime that new scientific information is brought to light, if they're operating from this theology, it's threatening their belief system. There's a really great book by a former professor of mine, my mentor, Michael Roos, called Darwinian Be a Christian. I highly recommend that book. He passed away last year, but he was a very important person in the history of biology and particularly in the debate between evolution and creationism. He was actually the expert witness in the Arkansas trial. But the conclusion of his book, Can a Darwinian Be a Christian, is that yes, of course, a Darwinian can be a Christian if you don't operate from a God of the gaps theology. Now, what's another main reason, as I start to wrap this episode up, another main reason that people gain a mistrust for things in general is when they're done for profit. I've said previously, I'm not going to get political on this show. And I don't intend to, in the sense of talking about political candidates or even political issues. But Frank Zappa said that politics is the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex. I'm not going to talk about the entertainment division, but I will talk about the military-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex. And the combination of these two things, just like how the fact that we were building railroads helped determine what we were discovering in geology, the fundamental motivator of a lot of science being done is now financial. Now, the geological discoveries from the railroad were an unintended consequence of financial and economic decisions that were driven by a multitude of human advancements. It's not like these people were going out and trying to make scientific discoveries in order to turn a profit. But that does sound really familiar, doesn't it? Does that process sound like something that you've seen? Because with medicine being for profit, with large amounts of what is being studied nowadays being determined by who gets grants, when you combine all of these complications that go into what has shaped the scientific community today, you really start to understand how, with just a little bit of motivation and a fundamental misunderstanding of what unites the scientific community, it's not a set of methodologies, but a set of ethical principles. The scientific method was a heuristic tool, literally invented for science education. There is no the scientific method. There are scientific methods. Those change. Those are shaped by culture. The reason that science works is because of the understanding and the agreement that scientists in the community have made to do their work with integrity, present their evidence publicly, and most importantly, being willing to change their worldview based on new information. That doesn't even mean you have to say you were wrong. Newton was wrong, if we want to be fundamentally clear, but that doesn't sound like the right way to characterize Newton. Newton was the most right that anybody was at his time. And when the scientific community reaches a consensus about a topic, you can usually bet that is the best understanding that we have about a topic at this time. No matter what drove us to get there. Now, things not being studied, things being studied certain angles, that all impacts things. And I'm not saying it doesn't. And I'm not saying that science wouldn't be better off if it wasn't bound by our culture. But it is, just like everything humans do is. Pretending it happens in a vacuum only generates mistrust when people realize that it doesn't. And emphasizing what makes science outlast those cultural parameters and scientific discovery be more credible than the conditions that they were discovered in requires a completely new understanding of the way science works as taught in our science education system. Thanks for listening. I'm Feddun. This has been Overeducated and Underemployed. Shout out to Lee Baines for inspiring the title. If you want me to answer a question on the podcast, shoot me an email, feddunxr@gmail.com. That's feddunxr@gmail.com. Check out feddun.net. In the next week or so, I'll be launching Feddun's Top 40. It'll be a playlist that rotates every week. I'll change it up a little bit. It'll be available on both YouTube Music and Spotify. It'll be music that I'm talking about on the podcast, music by people I'm interviewing on the podcast, and some of it's just music I'm listening to and enjoying. Once again, I'm Feddun. This has been Overeducated and Underemployed. Thanks for listening. On the next episode, we've got Cole Taylor from Classic City Wrestling. He's going to tell us all about how to start a wrestling empire. I hope you join us.